Righty. So, thanks everybody for joining us today. My name's Amy Loudermilk. I am the program manager for Arts Build. And for those of you who are joining us after a long time away or just need the reminder, Arts Build currently facilitates these services for our community arts partners. Those are the recipients of our mission support grants. And if you would like, I'm going to put the link to our shared services page from our website. That's in the chat right now if you wanted to access that and see more about what our shared services are. But we are here today, as always, to further Arts Build's mission to build community through the arts. And please use that link to learn more about both our shared services and the other programs that we put on. Today, we welcome our friends Connie Fernandez and Jeremy Burrows, who are fund, and I guess fun,
yeah.
development consultants with Skye Strategies. Our goal today is for you to leave with a better idea of how you, basically, we're doing a grant funding 101 for your organization. But before we get started, though, I wanted to remind everyone of other dates to take down for a shared services meeting. Our shared services meetings now take place on the second, third, and fourth Thursday of every month, typically around 10:30 a.m. We do put this out in our ArtsWire communication that goes out to all of our shared services friends, but go to ArtsBuild and sign up for ArtsWire if you'd like to get more information. Um, as a reminder, we're using the chat function as well as allowing for some open Q&A after Connie and Jeremy conclude their presentation. But as Connie tells me, this is a pretty bulky presentation, so we may have to do Q&A through email if we run out of time. But with that, I hand things over to Connie and Jeremy to take us through Grant Funding 101.
Okay, great. Thanks, Amy. So wanted to as always, thank ArtsBuild for allowing us to partner and to help them build community through the arts. Today it's grant development, grant research, grant writing, the whole kind of gamut of that 101. So there's a lot of content and we want to be respectful of your time. So just to preface it, there's going to be some slides that you can go back to that will have links that you can explore to help you do your own research, some things like that. I'm not going to go through and like read step by step. You guys can read just in the interest of time and try to give you as much information from our experience just doing this all the time that can be helpful in your journey trying to increase your funding through grants. So, Jeremy. So let's see. So really, what is a grant? I'm sure most of you guys know what a grant is, but it's not a loan. It doesn't need to be paid back unless sometimes if you're not compliant, you have to, but it usually has a very specific purpose. So they're typically restricted like for a specific program, for a project, for some capital need that you need. And we can go into detail some more about what that looks like. Who awards grants? There's a couple of different avenues that you can look for. So government, and that can be federal, state, or local. I know here we have city and county government. Not everybody is structured like that. But you want to look at all those different avenues. There's foundations, and then there's corporate entities and corporate foundations. And then the last would be like parent organizations for nonprofits. So that would be things like Habitat for Humanity. You know, they have affiliates. Urban Leagues have affiliates. Boys and Girls Clubs, Girls Inc., things like that. Not everybody falls into that category, but there's typically grant funding opportunities through parent organizations like that too. So who receives the grants? Typically 501c3, tax exempt, sometimes public charities, educational institutions. Those are the usual suspects. You do have some for-profits who can get like some research and technology grants that are out there. and then individuals, typically not, except the arts is actually luckily one of those exceptions to the rule. So um, that's kind of exciting for you guys, because and those aren't usually the larger grants, but if you have artists that you want to pay for their services to be a part of your projects, or whatever you're going to do, there are grants that can go directly to them. So that's pretty exciting, because really for a lot of other individuals, that just isn't the case. And then what does it support? So like I said, often, um, yeah, so what, sorry, on the what does it support, talking about on the last slide, I will say that there's program activities. We talked about hard costs. Oftentimes it will support indirect costs or soft costs up to about 10% for most grants. Some say none at all. Some will go up to 15%, but kind of the average is 10%. And there are more and more that are doing capacity building. And then the things that kind of are harder to fund are like straight salaries, just general operating. Those are kind of more tricky. And so you kind of have to write the grant a little creatively for that. But as far as by program area, this is national. So as you know, there will be different areas in communities where this may be skewed a little differently. But all in all, you can see that the arts takes up a little bit smaller chunk. But like I said, in other communities, that could be different. But this is about how it rolls out nationally. Now, as you're thinking about going for grants and you're looking at this piece of the pie, the reason I included this is because I think it's really good to be very like realistic when you're setting your goals, because I know a lot of times I see with boards, and all boards are different, but board members will be like, oh, well, there's a deficit. Let's go find some grants. And it's just really not that easy. It needs to be very strategic. And if you're only used to getting like one small grant a year, saying, well, next year we're going to raise 100,000 in grants, is probably not realistic. The best model is that you really only want about 20% of your overall funding base to be from grants. And that's because grants are finicky. We've seen this in the last year. We have people who are very dependent on specific grants on an annual basis. And then we get into a global pandemic, and lots of funders either shifted that focus or said, we're holding off on our spring round or fall, whichever round it was, or the return on their investment was just decreased so much they had a lot less to give out. So just be mindful of that, of not putting all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak, for the grant funding. And so those stats are really good when you're having the conversation with your finance folks or your board members, and you're planning for what you're going to do. You just want to make sure that it's attainable. So this is when folks call on us about our services, we really take them through thinking through whether they're ready and what types of grants they might be ready for, and maybe not yet, that they need to build. So one thing you really need to look at, and there are some self-assessments that you can find online, if you really want like a checklist, something more formal, but really, looking at, does your board give? It's very difficult when you go to write grant applications, and most of them nowadays will ask if your board gives. It used to just be, do they give, yes or no? Then it was, what percentage gives? And then now lots of them will actually ask, what is that dollar amount? Because they're going to look at your budget. And if you have like, a $250,000 budget and your combined board giving is $1,500, like that says something to the funder about the level of commitment. And then, do individuals give? Do you already have an annual giving campaign where people in the community and maybe region feel like your services warrant supporting? And then if you're scaling up, if you already are thinking, oh, I've gotten a few grants here or there, but I really need to scale up my grant funding, do the local foundations give? And if so, what? And just be thinking about that and how you can use that as a stepping stone, because quite often, people might want to run before they walk and go after, a federal grant, for instance, but they haven't really nailed down the local foundations in any meaningful capacity. So it's like you need to start there first, because that is the stepping stone, not always, but most often, to show those larger funders and state and federal funders that your community has skin in the game and believes in you and says that there is a need in the community that you're meeting. So the buy-in's the first thing. Documents, your 501c3 letter, IRS letter of determination. I mean, most everyone will have that. Although there are times when we get really far in conversations with folks to find out that they have not applied for this yet. They've sort of been operating as a nonprofit in spirit, but they don't really have all the legal stuff in place yet. So that's definitely something to have. And then when we talk about the annual audit, this is an independent audit, and then the annual 990. You're supposed to be filing the 990 anyway, and usually the folks who do your audit will also do the 990 paperwork. But we run into a lot of organizations who just really don't do the annual audit, primarily because of the cost associated with it, not because they can't do it or are hiding anything, but nearly every single funder requires this. So if you're in your first year of operation, obviously you can't have it. But if you have completed 1 or more years of operation, then they're going to expect that. So be thinking about that. Go ahead, if you don't do this, start sourcing folks. I always encourage people to choose a person or a company that really focuses on nonprofits and maybe government, because it's a whole set of different rules than just regular audits and CPAs. So think through those things, and then think through your financials. Organizational budget sounds like a no-brainer, but once again, I can tell you, we get into conversations with folks and we'll say, well, so what's your annual budget? And they can kind of give us a round number, but if we ask them for a budget and like a profit and loss statement for the last month, they don't have it. And so every single grant application is going to want your current year's operational. Some of them, I'm working on an NEA one, and they want the last 3 years. So they're wanting your operational budget, your actuals, and then this year's, goal set. So that, and then program budgets. Are you able to pull out? Do you know your financials well enough to say, okay, well, we have this small gallery here, but then we also have this other program where we go into schools, and then we also have this other program where we work with homeless. I'm just totally making up some programs. Can you, from that organizational budget, pull out the different program pieces and know what it costs to run those programs? Because in addition to organizational budgets, the grants are going to require program budgets for each of the quote unquote lines of business that you do. And then the capacity to manage an influx of grant funds. This is really important because, and it goes back to sort of being realistic about what you're going after. If your annual budget is $250,000, you probably are not going to be the best candidate for a $200,000 grant. I mean, you're almost doubling your budget in one fell swoop, and funders are going to be really gun shy of that. So, looking at that, if you don't have a bookkeeper or a financial manager or CFO or whatever that looks like right now, if you have a whole big influx of funds where you need to really be able to run reports and know what was spent where, can you do that? So that's really important on that end, just to make sure that you don't get messed up from a compliance standpoint. And then your infrastructure. Everybody has partners. What does that look like right now? Can you get formal MOUs in place? Are your partners such that they're comfortable with that? Because most of the grant applications will require some sort of formal commitment letter from partners. Do you have program objectives, or do you just kind of do what you do and you haven't really sat down because you're going to have clear, defined objectives for your programming? Do you evaluate your program? Let's see. Do you evaluate your programming? is anything in place where you actually collect data and look at your outcomes and then formally assess what that looks like and then modify, how you're doing things or what you're doing to based on the information you get, because evaluation piece is going to be a big part of your proposals. And then looking at staffing. If you have a staff of like 2 and you're proposing to do a large new project in 5 new schools in addition to all of your current programming, that may look to a funder like you're going to be way understaffed. So just kind of thinking through what that looks like, and are you able to hire more in the hopes that, those kinds of things that just come with it. So that's the assessing of the readiness. Okay, so our next slide talks about researching funding opportunities. These are the kind of things I'm not going to read to you. I wanted you to have different resources. And these are just some examples, but the foundation directory online, you can do all kinds of searches. That is a fee for service. It's quite hefty, but the Venture Forward has some opportunity for folks to come in and use. It used to be in a 2-hour time span, but you may want to check on that for free. So you can have that resource. I put Lyndhurst Foundation on here just as an example because they do have an arts, culture, and education focus. So that's something you may want to check in. It is an invitation only opportunity, so they don't just have open applications, but something to check out, as well as, you can Google foundation names and try to find websites. Signing up for notices and subscriptions. So when things, and this is just an example, 2 examples right there. So that way when new RFPs roll out, you get notified. And then checking out actual funders 990s, which can show you exactly who they're funding and at what level. Keeping abreast of the news media, what's going on locally, what are the things that people are interested in funding, just keeping up with that. Connecting with any foundation staff that you might know, program officers, things like that, or get to know them, start building that relationship. And then looking at your board members and volunteers and trying to source what kind of connections they may have to the funders. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on government grants. This is not everybody's cup of tea. But I do want you to know that you have to register for grants.gov. You also have to get a SAMS number. So if you think you're in the ballpark for those, go ahead and go to grants.gov and get that underway well in advance of applying for anything. A lot of the federal agencies have, in addition, their opportunities will be on grants.gov. To me, it's fine, but it can seem kind of overwhelming once you're in it. So if you know that you're only going to fit in with a certain federal agency, you could go directly to their website. I did put the National Endowment for the Arts website here, and they will also have information for their opportunities. And then gave an example on the state level for Tennessee Arts Commission. And then just check the city and government websites for, if you serve counties outside of Hamilton County, look at those as well. As far as corporate grants go, a lot of the larger corporations do have actual corporate foundations now and a formalized process to go through to apply for their funds. They also all have specific funding priorities, and you can take a look on their websites and see if you fall in line with any of those. But there still are sponsorships, like event sponsorships through marketing budgets, some community relations budgets, and employee matching funds. So I know UNM is the big one in town that a lot of people think of when they think of employee matching. So making sure that you're tapping into all of those if you can. Now, be mindful that sometimes if you get funding through one, not with the employee matching gifts, but with the other, like a marketing budget or something, sometimes if you've gotten funding at all through a corporate entity, then it makes you ineligible to apply for grant funding. So really think strategically. So if you You may get excited about a $5,000 sponsorship for your event, but you could have gotten a $25,000 grant through the foundation. So just make sure you're looking at all those angles when you go to research that. Obviously, connection to employees, maybe board members or volunteers, and then really paying attention to geographic connection. So a lot of corporations want to fund either where their headquarters are located or their different plants or offices, and especially where their employees are like doing live, work, play. So as you're going through and compiling all this research, these are the things I would recommend that you look at. Look at the funders' funding history. Are they funding organizations that have similar missions and projects to you? Or do they never fund, like, because you may be kind of loosely in their priority area, but do they really fund in that area? So kind of really assessing that, what types of awards are they multi-year? Do they tend to, give repeatedly each year to the same org, things like that? The average award size, do you fall into the geography focus, and payout requirement? And by that, I mean, you can have grants where once you get the award, they give you the full grant, or they may give you half and then give you the rest after, a mid-year reporting period, or they may be reimbursable. And what that means is you have to spend all the cash up front, and then you have to submit for reimbursement from the grant. And if it's an eligible expense, then they'll cut you a check for it. And you really have to make sure that your organization has the cash flow up front to be able to do those kinds of grants. Also look at compliance. You want to make sure that once you get the dollars, you can comply with the regulations around the grant contract. So looking at their cycles and all the deadlines for reporting or disbursement or project completion, some are very specific in how many months you have and what dates and this and that. Some will have match requirements. So yeah, we'll give you 25, but you got to match it 1-for-1 with a $50,000 project. But if you can't come up with that 25, and some will say it doesn't have to be all cash, it can be in kind, just really paying attention to those parameters. And then, we work with several, especially corporate foundations that have some pretty robust marketing and media requirements. They want to make sure that if they're going to invest in the community, that the community knows about it. So making sure that you have in-house capacity or you can outsource it to be able to meet requirements like that. And just the other general reporting requirements, just making sure it's something you can do if you were to be awarded it. And so in order to kind of keep all those things in line, you need some good systems in place. So one of the easiest systems that you could start out with is really, we call it like a data sheet. So that when you're researching possible grant opportunities, you have some sort of document on each of them. Yes, you can print something out from an online search. Quite often usually we have to dig much, much deeper than that. It's very, that information gets filled out once when maybe who knows how long ago, and then it just sits there. So a lot of it doesn't get updated, and it's not very robust. So you want to figure out what's important to you for your organization, put those categories in a data sheet, and then for every opportunity you research, fill out the sheet. So that way you have that information for every single opportunity. So when you sit down with your fundraising committee or whatever, you're comparing apples to apples. You can see deadlines, you can see, grant amounts, you can see everything just side by side. It makes it figuring out which opportunities you should go for a lot easier. And it also just gives you, a nice little repository of, things you can go back to. Maybe it's not a complete no, it's just a not right now. And then you'll have that and you won't forget about it. Because if you just go through and search and look online, in 3 months, you're not going to remember what you looked at. All right. And so once you have done the research, you kind of have some opportunities that you think you want to go after throughout the year, you want to start trying to foster a relationship. Now, there are some cases where this isn't required, and often they will say, uh, no phone calls, please, or something like that. But typically, and especially in our local realm, you're going to want to speak with the program officer. You're going to get in front of this individual and tell them about what you're doing. Um, you know, what are you doing and why are you doing it? Like, why is it needed? And talk to them about how, where you could possibly fit into their funding profile, and get them excited about what you're doing, and then listen to their feedback. I think a big mistake that we see people make is going and guns a blazing, like, I know I'm a perfect fit. This and this and that. And they're kind of telling the foundation what they should do, which typically doesn't go over super well. But sitting back and listening to the advice, um, and just kind of, taking that in, but meeting them, getting face to face if you can, or obviously Zoom, but even a call is great. And let's say that, for instance, let's say it's an invitation only and you don't get an invitation after your first meeting. Well, that's fine. And it may be like you're absolutely not a fit, but if the door is left open, or if they give you some advice for some things they would like to see you do before they might be interested, then if those are things you want to do them, and then loop back around. We hear from funders that the only time they hear from certain people is when they want to ask for money, which, yes, that's their purpose, but it's kind of hard if you ask for money and you do your project or whatever, and then they don't hear from you for 5 years. That's not a relationship, really. That's more like a bank. So if you're going to try to foster that relationship and the door is kept open, then maybe, put them on the list to receive an annual update or something like that. So I know when I do this, a lot of times people say, well, I didn't know I could even, talk to the funder. So I want to make sure that relationship building, that you guys know, not only is it okay to do it, but they want that relationship, and to know where their funds are going, and who's conducting the work. So typical proposal components. We're going to go through each one of these as steadily as we can. All right, agency background. This is a typical section. Some will keep it really limited to a mission statement. Others want to know like examples of your program history, like history of success for your program. So, I just encourage everyone, if you don't have this written up already, go ahead and write it up. And these are the things to consider. And in that way, you have that narrative to pull from. And you may have to expound upon it. You may have to cut it back, but at least it's already, there. It's a jumping off point. The next one is the need statement. And this one is a little trickier. Real quick on that agency background, please keep the funder in mind as your target audience. I know we all have like things that we love about our programming, and just be mindful, especially if there's word counts and things like that you're getting the most important information in. But on the need statement, this is where you need to have your research done. So you're telling them why you're doing what you're doing, because it's meeting a critical need in your community, and basically why you can do it better than somebody else. So any of your research, any of your data, as you collect research, go ahead and include the citation with it so that you can use that in your proposals and you don't forget where the information came from, things like that. If you've been doing surveys, I know a lot of people do surveys and they collect them and they sit there. They don't ever really look at them and they don't compile the responses. So if you fall in that category, start coming up with a plan for actually taking that data and using it and turning it into something meaningful that can prove why you need to be doing what you're doing. So once again, you can go ahead and write this up. When you're writing it, write it as if the person reviewing it knows nothing about your community. So you may think, oh, well, they know what the community in Orchard Knob looks like. Well, maybe not. So don't take for granted. So go ahead and write it up. With a lot of data, break it up in a table if you can, something that's visually appealing that doesn't bog you down. With some online systems, they will allow tables. In that case, you can always use bullet points. And so then we go into the project description, kind of like the who, what, where kind of thing. And be specific. So any kind of data, like if it's a national model, if it's evidence-based, including those kinds of things here is really important. If there's specific qualifications or experience of staff who's conducting it, especially if it's an award winner in XYZ, or they've had X amount of years teaching whatever, if their artwork's been displayed wherever it has been, things like that that are going to add weight to why your organization is really, really in a position to be the lead on this project. And then the next one, this is probably somewhat small, maybe not. Logic model. So we encourage everyone to create a logic model for every single program. This is totally made up here. So I made up just, something, that could possibly flow together. So with your inputs, that's your resources. So really thinking about what you need to carry out the project and list those out. And then for the outputs, you have activities and participants. So what are you going to do? In this case, it was provide weekly art classes at youth and family development centers, provide art mentors, and then a final showcase, just keeping it simple. But then talk about the participants. So when you think about participants, it's not just, the people filling the chairs. There's a lot of other people participating in the program to make it happen. And then we had some short and long-term outcomes. Short term, you definitely want that to be, and honestly, these short terms are not very measurable, what I put in here. Ideally, they would be measurable. But then the long terms can be a little bit esoteric sometimes. And you're talking sometimes 3 to 5 years, and your program funding may only just be for 1 year, but they can see what your ultimate goal. Sometimes proposals will want midterm goals as well. But just really thinking through this, and why I said go ahead and do these for all of your programs, it really helps to sort of audit your program effectiveness, and also where there may be any gaps, especially with your inputs and resources. If you're thinking, man, these are the activities we do, but these are the activities we should be doing or adding or would like to make it more effective, but we would need these inputs in order to do it. So it can really guide your strategic direction for your programming. And then if you have a document like this already started, when you go to write the proposal, it's going to be a lot easier. All right, and then finally, evaluation. Each grant proposal is going to want an evaluation component. It should flow naturally from your goals and objectives from the logic model. So make sure they're lines. So you shouldn't see something out of the blue on your evaluation plan that wasn't listed in the other, because it's just not going to link up. And then there's 2 types of evaluations you want to consider, and they may not be both appropriate, but typically they are, and it's the process evaluation and then the evaluation of the outcomes. So is the process going according to your plan? And I would say this could possibly be more important right now than ever before, because a lot of folks have had to switch from a lot of in-person programming to virtual programming, or just some different formats, and you might not know what that looks like. So as far as, does it work? Will people log on and show up? Are they getting out of it what they could get out of it in person? So really analyzing, is the process, is the service delivery working the way, and getting those intended results or not, and should we change it? And then the outcomes, obviously, are our goals, is the project achieving the goals and having the desired impact? A lot of people want to evaluate programs at the very end, and that's fine. A lot of funders like to see that you're looking at things, especially if you're talking about large dollars and a large endeavor, especially if it's new, maybe looking at it quarterly. Because if you really need to change something, if you're really not hitting your goals, by that mid-year mark, mid-project mark, then you need to adjust something in order to be able to have that impact that you wanted. You got to consider what data you want to collect, like what makes sense, what's meaningful, and then how you're going to collect it. Like we mentioned surveys earlier, but there's all kinds of different ways to collect data. And then how are you going to evaluate it? Who's going to evaluate it? And then what are you going to do with it? Sharing of data is really big for funders because they want whatever you've learned to be shared with like organizations, hopefully, or, adjacent partners who are still working in the realm, but maybe a little bit differently. Like, what did you learn? So that other folks can build upon that. And then it makes it more collaborative instead of you just keeping it kind of a secret to yourself and, okay, guys, good luck doing it in your neck of the woods. So thinking about how the data can be shared. Do you have a big social media presence? Do you have like a good marketing team that likes to put together infographics or whatever that is? But those are just things to consider. And also, what do you have the capacity to do is another big one. And then sustainability is next. Everyone wants to know, is the project going to be sustainable? Sometimes the project doesn't need to be sustainable. Maybe it's a first phase of something. Maybe it's actually an evaluation itself, or a feasibility study or something like that, that once it's over, or strategic planning. There are certain instances where there's not a continuation of the project, but really sitting down and thinking, like, is it a wing and a prayer? Like, do we have a plan? Are we talking to any local partners? Sometimes we have, like a corporate entity that will come alongside and be like, hey, we can, if you get this grant, we can match it. And then if you're doing what you say, we'll be on for the next year for the same amount. I mean, sometimes that happens, and you'll be able to articulate that in the grant. But think through realistically, how are you going to continue this? Because a lot of people don't want to fund a one and done if it needs to be sustained. If the goals you want to achieve with it need to be achieved over a longer period than 1 year. Okay, so then we talked about the program budget a little bit earlier. And these are just some examples, like a little jumping off point for you guys if you guys aren't used to creating program budgets. Income, expenses, thinking through what that income looks like. Some people do include in kind, which is fine. If it's like, so let's just say you had your budget and you said, well, we're going to need space. Okay, I'm going to allot like $5,000 to rent space. Well, if someone comes in and donates that space, then I would include that on your budget because that shows support from the community. And then for your expenses, obviously compensation, that could be staff, you might need to hire contractors, any kind of benefits that go into that, equipment and materials, the hard costs of the program, rent and utilities, and then let's see, marketing. Sometimes there's marketing. There's some other expense categories. I mean, like I said, so if you're allowed an administrative fee, or if you're allowed any kind of percentage of overhead or soft costs, you can add those in. And like I said, this is just a jumping off point to kind of get your mind going. So we will go on. So those are the main components, typical components of a grant. So if you work through those pieces on your own and start trying to pull together those sections, then when you go to actually write proposals, you will be in a much better position. So top 10 reasons for proposal rejection. Quite simply, the directions aren't followed. And I mean, there's some grants, they specify the type of spacing, the size font, the type of font. I mean, sometimes things are very specific. word counts, character counts, all of these kinds of things. So follow the directions. Um, Missing a deadline, obviously. Program doesn't match the funder's priorities. That definitely can get it kicked out pretty easily. Um, just missing sections, outcomes not provided, or the outcomes are really like, people look at it and they're like, these aren't real outcomes. Just to have people show up and attend is not an outcome, things like that. If they know that there's a lot of duplication of services, so like especially locally, the foundations kind of have a good finger on the pulse of what's going on in their funding priority areas. So if you come up and I've got this great new program and it's like two others around, that may not bode well for you. When I say blanket or form proposal, we have folks and companies do this too. They write one proposal and it's fairly generic, and they just kind of recycle that with every funder, and doesn't really answer the questions. It doesn't really include the content that they want, and funders can sniff that out a mile away. If it needs to be sustainable, and it's not, and there's no way, funders may not want to be on the hook for you to come back year after year. We talked about sort of the unrealistic funding expectations before. Like I said, if you're going after a $200,000 grant, but your budget's only $250,000, probably doesn't make a lot of sense. Just if it's confusing, the writing score, like they can't understand exactly what you were going to do, or why you were going to do it, and past missed reporting. So once you get awards, make sure you're reporting on time and keeping up with all the compliance things, because what we find is folks go back the next year to reapply for something and they have outstanding reporting, and the funder's like, hey, you've missed report deadlines, and we're going to sit it out this year. So and then finally, we have best practices for proposal development. Once again, follow the guidelines exactly. Most systems are online now, so what we recommend is having all of the sections in a Word document. Work in that Word document. You can easily edit. You can spell check and all that kind of good stuff. You can count your words or your characters more easily in Word, and then cut and paste once you get it to how you want it, and then save that document so you have it's saved somewhere. Numerous occasions we start working with someone and they have PDFs of what they've submitted, which is fine, but they've just worked right in the system, and there's not a really good clean copy of what they've submitted. So it makes it harder to maybe reuse sections and rework sections and kind of know what's been submitted. If you can use visuals, break things up, especially if it's a lot of text. Regurgitate language from the RFP. So if they're calling something one thing, and maybe you in your world call it a little bit, use their language. Use it for headings. Like if they've been using headings, you use the same headings, things like that. Active voice, no slang or acronyms or abbreviations that they're not going to know what it is. Make sure you spell it out first, then you can use it. Try to keep the flowery language to a minimum or non-existent, and include all the required attachments, and look at what those attachments are from the very beginning, because a lot of times people need to work on those ahead of time. Those are your letters of support or your partner MOUs. Those are program budgets, organizational budgets, audits. Sometimes there's special demographics documents that they want you to fill out. Use high quality letters of support. It's not the best to write one sentence and then have that same sentence for all your partners. You just change the partner name. That doesn't really instill a lot of confidence in the funder. So make it specific to what those partners are bringing to the table and the time of, the length that you've partnered with them and any achievements that you guys have made together. And then always keep the audience in mind. What their funding priorities are. So don't rabbit trail and talk about something, even if it's the favorite thing that you guys do in your mind, and it's the most important. If it doesn't really align and it doesn't it doesn't have much to do with what you're asking for. Just stay on topic, keep the audience in mind. I have flown through all of that. I'm sorry I was talking 90 miles a minute, but I wanted to get through a lot of content. Our emails are up there, websites up there. I think there might be a few
I think we
questions.
have some questions, Connie. Yeah.
Yeah, it's Amy. I wanted to bring a couple things up. We had a few folks who had to jump off early, and so I just wanted to pose some questions that were emailed to
Sure.
me that I think are specific to a lot of the organizations that are present right now,
Okay.
and so we might need to offer some clarification.
Okay.
So going back to the two things that you said early on about board financial giving being the measurement tool. So we've had discussions in the past where for certain nonprofits that's not necessarily the case.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we've talked about other ways, for example, uh, talking about the audit for the second portion.
Yeah.
Arts Build doesn't require an audit for funding. So can you start with that one and kind of offer some clarification on the size of funders versus auditing and how that works?
You guys are in the minority for that one.
Okay.
That is not typical, and it's probably because of who you focus on funding. But pretty much, I mean, by and large, and Jeremy, you weigh in on that. I mean, that's a pretty standard component.
Is there maybe a difference between local and national in terms of the auditing process?
Not really.
Because we've got at least 6 agencies that don't require it. So that's why I brought that up.
It's a typical component for what we see now, and it also depends on, and Jeremy, jump in on this because I feel like you might have a better handle on what I'm trying to say. You know, not all cases are the same. We have run into cases where it's a required component, but there's some sort of, extenuating circumstance. And we've reached out to program officers and we've talked through, but even when that's happened, they've wanted an audit by the time the funding goes out.
There are some, I have seen some exceptions too, where if the organization is either new enough or small enough, if their budget is, under a certain amount, often they will waive that audit requirement and just require the 990 in place of it. Yeah, I have seen that occasionally. It's not super common, but that's the most common exception is a small enough budget.
So I would say if you don't have one, if that's not your practice, I wouldn't just say, well, I'm not going to look for grant funding. I would definitely build that relationship, reach out. I mean,
absolutely.
There's been foundations can do whatever they want to do. You know what I mean? So if they feel like there is a real need to waive it or to help someone acquire getting one or whatever, then they can make that happen if they're really interested in your programming. It would not be the norm, but it does happen. So I wouldn't say just don't go after it by any stretch.
Okay. Thank you for that. I appreciate the clarification. And Jeremy, thank you for that information as well. And then I wanted to touch on the board financial giving.
Yeah.
Just as a specific reference, and I know we have other organizations who are here that may have similar approaches to this, but we don't require board financial giving. And so we actually encourage our board members to give time, talent, and other ways, treasure, whatever, in terms or as opposed to the financial giving. So can you talk a little bit more about maybe organizations that you've worked with who do that and what that looks like?
And, I think that that's very important. Like grants aside, if you have a lawyer on your board and you have a legal issue and that person's been putting in a lot of pro bono work, absolutely figure out, value that so you know what's going on. I think that's really important. Now, where it gets into the grants is they tend to be very specific about what they're asking. And they will specifically say what percentage of your fundraising comes from the board, or what percentage of the board donates, and that you may have to say donates financially. And then sometimes the questions are, how much financial contribution does your board get? So usually it's very specific, and I've not seen a lot of opportunity in those sort of like one-liner questions to be able to say, to give a value, because it isn't financial. Does that make sense? Now, there's others where it's more of a narrative question. How does your board support the organization? We see that one a lot. And then in those cases, you could definitely have an opportunity to write about general support and include those in kind and time and energy and all of that kind of stuff, which is definitely also valuable. So it kind of depends on the funder and how the question's worded.
And Connie, I don't know if you've seen this as well, but I actually see that the board giving questions more often in the local foundations than I do in the national grants. So I don't know if it is more of a local issue that we're running into. And I often see if it is a national opportunity and they have a question like that, there usually is a lot more narrative space to explain it.
I would agree.
More of a generic, does your board support you and how? So those specific kind of percentage budget ones, I do see way more often in the local smaller foundations, it seems.
And I would, and this is me and my guess is my own personal opinion, over the last 10 years, there has been like a push among, just like, from Center for Nonprofits, now Venture Forward and everything, to have that conversation with boards, like when boards are training and this and that, because 10 years ago, that was just not an expectation at all. And you have a large group that tend to serve on a lot of different boards. So it seems to be the same people on a lot of different boards. I think there was a huge effort to try to continue to have that conversation, to set that expectation, and also to set that expectation for the next generation of board members, if that makes any sense. So that may be why we see that locally being so specific.
Thank you. I know that was a ton of information in a very compact in a very compact time. And again, to the folks who are still with us and the folks who are watching this after the fact, please use this contact information that Connie and Jeremy have provided, and they can talk to you about their services and their retainers that they offer. Wanted to see, are there any other questions? There must be with all that information.
And if you guys step away and have conversations with other staff or board and a question comes up later, feel free to reach out and say, hey, I attended this and this has come up, and we'll see what we can do.
Actually, we've got one question, Curtis.
Yes, I just had a quick question. Like I'm in the food business. So like, where would some places I would need to look at? Because a lot of places that I've looked for, it just seems like it's not working in my favor.
So when you say in the food business, what
like restaurant?
Okay, so are you a nonprofit organization?
I am not as of right now. No, I'm not a nonprofit organization, but I do a lot of things outside of outside of here where I volunteer and do a lot of mentoring programs. But I'm not a 501c3 at all. So
therein lies the rub for you. You're doing a lot of community support activities, and you're in unfortunately kind of a in between gray area, because a lot of the a lot of opportunities require that you do have your 501c3 status. So we get a lot of calls from folks that do have a for-profit business that they love doing and giving back, and they're trying to figure out what do they do, and it's very individualized per organization or business, whether that makes sense for them to do it or not. There's a lot of constraints once you go that route. So, but right now, as far as grant funding, you would be extremely limited. what you could possibly do is wherever you are working with in the community, maybe find a nonprofit that can apply and then write you into the grant as funding the food or whatever, you know what I'm saying? Like there could be some possibility there, but as far as you being the lead applicant, that's going to be probably not in.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And for those of us, we're getting several questions from folks who had to join us a little later than they'd hoped to. We do record these sessions and we will post it to our YouTube page as soon as it's available and done processing on Zoom. We send it over to YouTube. So I've put the YouTube link a few times in the chat. So let me know if you still need that information. We've got about 4 minutes left. If there's any other questions. I don't see any hands raised. Okay. Well, with that, thank you to Connie and Jeremy for such a ton of information, useful information for our folks in getting funding, because I know that's on everybody's mind right now, especially with what's going on in the greater world around us. But just as a reminder to everybody, Skye Strategies will be with us on the third Thursday of every month. So I believe February, that date is, let me pull up my calendar here. Let's see, what day is that? That is going to be February 11th. No, February 18th. Is that what you've got, Connie?
Yes.
Okay, so February 18th, we will visit with Skye Strategies again. Next Thursday at 10:30 in the morning, we'll be visiting with Colleen Miller, who is going to help us with our planning for social media in 2021. So thank you all for joining us today. And with that, I'll give you about 3 minutes of your time back. And have a great weekend. And if I haven't already told you, Happy New Year. Thanks, y'all.
So much.
Thanks.
Bye.